Hello, thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Feel free to tell us where you're joining from in the chat. Thank you for joining us. Hello, thank you for joining today's webinar. We are ready to begin. Today's webinar is eligible for 1 contact hour. Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society of Nursing, Sigma, is accredited as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the American Nurses Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. No one in control of the content today have any relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies. To receive contact hours for this NCPD session, participants are required to attend the webinar and log into our learning management system to complete an evaluation form. Information on how to access this will be emailed to all attendees approximately 1 week after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available via the learning management system. Following the presentation, if we have time, we'll have a question and answer session. You'll see on your Zoom webinar control panel that you can send a message through the Q&A feature. This is where you can type in any question you'd like to pose to our presenters. Be sure to hit send so the message makes it to us. Please use the Q&A for questions and the chat feature to interact with all other participants. We'd like to thank our speaker for sharing their expertise with us today. Of note, thoughts and views expressed are that of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect that of Sigma. This webinar is proudly sponsored by Pro Liability and is the last webinar in the Creating Safety Nets for Your Nursing Practice webinar series. Our presenter today is Madison Edwards. Madison is a nursing professional with extensive experience in nursing leadership and regulation. Based in Oklahoma City, Madison has served as a director in both inpatient and ambulatory settings and as the director of nursing in a Joint Commission certified facility. With a background in surgery and perioperative care, Madison has held large interdisciplinary teams in a variety of healthcare settings, ensuring the highest standards of patient care. Additionally, Madison has contributed to the nursing profession as the Associate Director for Nursing Practice for a State Board of Nursing, demonstrating a commitment to quality and regulatory compliance. Madison has a passion for creating high reliability processes to ensure safe patient care. Thank you so much, and we're going to turn it over to Madison.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm so glad that you're joining me today for our third and final installment of this webinar series. Today, we're going to talk about the Board of Nursing, talking about regulation and licensure issues. So just a brief introduction. I think Linda covered it pretty well. I'm the Executive Vice President of Clinical Risk Services for OmniSure Risk Management Consulting. I have a big experience in surgery, transplant service, particularly liver and kidney. Those were my favorite years. I have extensive experience working at the Board of Nursing, and so I'm really excited to share those experiences with you today. So today's topics get a little bit into the nitty gritty of your practice and how we know what we can do as nurses, what our scope looks like as nurses. So we're going to talk about the board, how it's founded in statute and code, and what it uses to regulate our license. We're going to talk a little bit about the NCSBN and their role with the Nursing Licensure Compact. We're going to talk about decision-making models, which may be something that you already know a ton about or something that you know nothing about. That's typically what I find. And when I found out about them, I knew nothing about them. We're going to talk about disciplinary action and board hearing processes and the most common licensure issues that we see. So every state can look a little bit different as far as what their board regulates. Some boards regulate just registered nurses. Some boards regulate nurses and LPNs and APRNs. Some just regulate APRNs, and they can be all sectioned out or they can be all together. So boards are made up of staff and non-staff. So when I worked at the board, I worked as staff. The board members who sit on the board, they're not in the office every single day. They are just there for those really big meetings, and then other committee things or special events. Staff include people who take care of all the licensing that get done in every day that's done by staff members, investigations, alternative to discipline programs, which is what we see for substance abuse or alcohol use. Those programs are all managed and taken care of by board staff. And then education. So those are the people who make sure that all the education programs reach all the statutory requirements. And then they take their findings to the board from all of these departments to help them make decisions with what they did in their role as staff members. But the board themselves are comprised typically in most states. Here's my really big disclaimer. This whole webinar is very, very state and jurisdiction specific. So I'm located in the United States. So it may look completely different where you are. It may look similar. In many states, there's enough to kind of be consistent-ish. But with that said, every state's going to look totally different. So typically the governor will take recommendations from either advising or existing board members as to who should be on the board. And sometimes they need Senate approval depending on the state. They have term lengths that they'll serve and then they'll roll off the board or they'll roll into a new role. So let's say they serve for 4 years, maybe 1 year they'll be the secretary, next year they'll be the vice president, the year after they'll be the president. It's different everywhere, but sometimes they roll in and out of different roles. There are many levels of licensure that can be represented on the boards depending on who that board regulates. And then often there are members of the public, and these members are extremely valuable to boards. And think of them almost like the family members that are sitting in your patient's room. So if the patient can't talk, or if the patient's a pediatric patient and their mom and dad, those are kind of like these people on the board because everything they hear from a non-medical background or a non-influence. They're not so close to the material or to the subject matter that they can't have a really objective look at it. So those are often really valued and trusted members that sit on the board as well. So like I said, they're typically not in the office every day. They will come from all over the state. They'll be in all different jurisdictions, and all of that's outlined in the Nursing Practice Act. And they'll go to meetings as they're scheduled. So they can either be monthly, every other month, quarterly. All of the states are different. And then they may sit on a committee or council, and we'll talk more about those here in a minute. So the general principles are that the Board of Nursing is created by statute or law made by a lawmaker that goes through the whole legislative process, and they regulate through different regulatory documents. So the Practice Act, the Administrative Code, policies and procedures, position statements, declaratory rulings, and so they regulate licensing, licensees and their practice, and nursing education programs. And then, of course, they investigate. So statutes and laws are used interchangeably. And an example of a statute or law would be the Nursing Practice Act. And just like we talked about in our previous webinar, if you made it, if not, we'll go over it again just a little bit. The Nursing Practice Act gives the Board of Nursing the ability to author the administrative code or the rules. And so those are written by the state agency under their statutory given authority. So think of the Nursing Practice Act as a very big and broad statement. It's not a terribly long document in most states. The rules are going to be considerably longer. So the Nursing Practice Act might say that a nurse practitioner has the ability to write prescriptions, but then the rules are going to actually go into how they can do that, the regulation of it, and all the things that go into licensing that person, regulating their practice. So that's actually where a lot of really good stuff comes into play. And so that's how the board will determine how that process is going to work. They're going to meet with the DEA, the State Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and they're going to take all of those things into account that a lawmaker may not take into account when they write the law. But the board will be able to take it into account when they write the administrative code or the rules. So there's also such thing as emergency rules. We saw this a lot with COVID. We've seen this with issues that happen that the Board of Nursing may not have the luxury of time to send something through the entire legislative process to be approved. So that will happen from time to time as well. But all of that will be on your Board of Nursing's website. In fact, they'll typically have the most current copy of the rules, and then they will have proposed rules, which means new things that they've written that need to go to their board for approval. And then they'll have proposed rules that are passed that will have an effective date, say 6 months or 12 months from now. And so these are constantly getting updated, whereas the Nursing Practice Act is very seldomly what they refer to as opened. They very seldomly open the Nursing Practice Act, but the rules, that's a little bit of a different process and they get touched all the time. And so I encourage you to go to your state's website and look at the rules, look at their proposed rules, and see if anything is changing. And I would almost promise you that it does, because that's one thing, is that our practice is constantly evolving. So state boards have other modalities of defining on a non-regulatory issue, something that isn't worthy of maybe legislation or rules, or sometimes the board needs to publish an opinion or an interpretation of the law that just can't wait, like I said, through the whole process. So what they can do, boards have other ways to make public these viewpoints for not only their licensees, but the general public. And like I said, we saw these come up too a lot with COVID. And these are guidelines, practice policies. And I like to say policies is with a lowercase p, because policy can also be interpreted as meaning law, position statements, and declaratory rulings. So guidelines are recommendations or suggestions provided by the board to help nurses interpret the law or the rules and apply those in their practice. They offer direction on best practices, but they're not typically legally binding. And then practice policies, like I said, with a lowercase p, so not a law, they detail actual practices that provide guidance to licensees and entities. Some states will have these be things like administration of IV therapy from an LPN. They'll have a practice policy on that. This is what you need to look for in your facilities policy. This is how to do this the best. Position statements are taken by the Board of Nursing on specific issues related to nursing practice, education, or regulation. So some examples of those would be a position statement about school nursing. Why would we need a position statement about school nursing? Clearly, we all support school nurses and we want them to do a good job. But the reason that a position statement might be needed is school nurses are actually governed by multiple areas of law. It might be the health department, it might be the Board of Education. In every state, it looks different. But all this to say, when you have so many pieces of legislation that touch how you practice, the odds are that some of those can directly conflict with one another. So you might have a Nursing Practice Act that says a nurse can't function independently, but then you might have a um, education board item in their legislation that says, yes, the nurse can see this and she can address it. So oftentimes nursing boards will make statements that help them navigate those sticky situations a little bit better. Declaratory rulings are formal, they're binding interpretations of the law that are issued by the Board of Nursing in response to a specific question about how laws or regulations apply in specific situations. So they have typically legal weight and can be used to guide future decisions on similar issues. Some examples of those that I've seen include like laser hair removal. The state may have varying opinions from varying boards whether as to who can do that. And so somebody might come to the board and say, well, I need you to tell me, can I or can I not do it? And so sometimes they'll issue a declaratory ruling of those statements. Sometimes they'll decline to. It's the board's prerogative to determine what they want to do or how they want to address that. So, why do all these things matter? Well, if your license is and your practice comes into question by either the Board of Nursing or let's say you're sued by a plaintiff's attorney, they're going to compare your practice to three things: the law, the standard of care, so leaning on your professional organization, and then lastly, these kind of statements or guidelines that are available to you from your board. So again, I encourage you to go look and see if any of these are available to you or are published by your board. And I've kind of seen the gambit too. Some boards have none. Some boards have some. They might have five or six, and some boards might have 40 on all varying things. And so it's really interesting to kind of dig through there and even going into different states, even though they don't apply to you, it's interesting to see how other states have addressed the exact same thing. And what you'll find is that it's so different everywhere. So often the board will utilize councils or committees to support the authoring of new policies and procedures and guidelines. So there are councils which are written into the Nursing Practice Act. So it might say something like that nurse practitioners can prescribe medications, but only as named by a policy authored by a statutory council. So a council is a group of people who meet and are required to meet by law. A committee is an advisory committee. They're not statutory. They might be mentioned in the rules, but they often will opine on things like new education initiatives in the state, changing certain requirements. So that will still go to an advisory committee. And then what both of these groups do typically is they will look at whatever is presented to them in session. Councils typically and committees are public meetings. You can go to those just like you could a board hearing or a board meeting, and they will take the information that's presented to them, often by board staff, and then they will take that information to the board. And the board will either say, yes, we approve what the council said, let's add that to this policy, or no, we respectfully decline, and they won't add whatever that recommendation is from that council to a policy or procedure. So the NCSBN is a organization that I talk about often. So it's the National Council of State Boards of Nursing, and I'll just keep calling it the NCSBN. So it is an international nonprofit organization whose mission is to support nursing regulators in their mandate to protect the public. And most famously, they're known for authoring and administering the NCLEX exam. So, but they do lots of other things outside of the NCLEX exam. So, for example, this fiscal year, these are their strategic plans. They want to promote agile regulatory systems for relevance and responsiveness to change, champion regulatory solutions to address borderless healthcare delivery. So, big proponent of, and actually the creator of the compact. They want to strengthen the capacity and capability and diversity engagement of regulatory leadership and pioneer competency assessments to support the future of healthcare and the advancement of regulatory excellence. So all these things that you see on here are different things that they touch or they promote or are built by the NCSBN. So there are 59 US members that are part of the NCSBN. So that includes 50 states, the District of Columbia, 4 territories, and then a couple states that have kind of those broken up or disjointed boards that work in different pieces. And so all of those funnel up into the SBN. And then they also have 21 associate members who are either regulatory boards or regulatory authorities that either in whole or part empowered by their governments to license and regulate nursing practice outside of the US. And that includes the Puerto Rico Board of Nurse Examiners, the Singapore Nursing Board, the Nurses Association of New Brunswick, Nursing and Midwifery Board in Australia and Ireland, and the Nursing and Midwifery Board Council in New South Wales Council. the Nursing Council of New Zealand, and that's just to name a few. So you can really get an appreciation for how massive this group is, and how many places they have expertise coming from. I think that's something that's so great about what they do, really, is their goal to kind of globalize and provide care without borders. Oops, sorry about that. Is something that's built into their mission. So they also provide to us a model act and model rules. And what those are they write an example of kind of what an ideal state nursing practice act would look like and an ideal state rules would look like. And states and other participating parties can use those. Some states nearly mirror what their legislation looks like, their model legislation looks like, and some states take bits and pieces of it. But because, like I said, the act itself is not opened very often, sometimes they'll just enact pieces of that that are appropriate at that time as to not make an overhaul of legislation. The other thing that they do is they wrote the Nurse Licensure Compact model language. And why is that important? So here is just a snippet of some of the participating jurisdictions that are part of the Nurse Licensure Compact, or the NLC. And there are currently 42 jurisdictions who have passed the legislation. Now, that doesn't mean that it's active yet, but when they pass the legislation, it means they're making a plan to. So the NCSBN's goal with the Nurse Licensure Compact is to provide better access to care, assist in expanding telehealth. It provides disaster and pandemic relief to get the right person to the right place, to provide personnel to take care of all the patients. It greatly supports military families. I can't tell you how much of a headache this can be when families are relocating and a member of that family needs to get licensed quickly. Nursing licensure compacts can be super helpful to them. Um, it facilitates online education. It's cost effective and it's flexible, and it allows nurses to move around and not have to get a ton of licenses. But what it also does is it creates minimum requirements to have their license, and they're often greater requirements that are just required for a state license. So a lot of people will argue that somebody who has a compact license, they often have a fingerprint background exam that covers the whole United States, or wherever their legislation says that it needs to come from. The minimum standards are just typically higher than what the state standards are. And so the NCSBN really does also believe that this is improving the quality of the nurses that are licensed in this way as well. So I'm not sure if you knew this or not, but there's actually a whole separate act and rule that are for nurses who hold a compact license, and they're required to be passed the exact same way in each state, which is why we see some states are later to adopt this legislation. But the way that the NLC legislation is written is it has to be passed in each state in its entirety. You can't change any of it. You can't throw any of it out. You can't say, oh, we just want this little piece. You either have to wholly enact all of the legislation, or your state doesn't get to participate. So any modification would void a state's participation into the compact. And so another thing that a lot of people don't know is that you have to be living in a state that has the Nurse Licensure Compact enacted in order to join the compact. So you can't live in a non-participating state and then join the compact. And so typically the NLC bases that off of where you vote and where you pay taxes, and that's how they determine that. So now we're going to transition and talk a little bit about your personal scope of practice. And so how is our scope of practice defined? Well, our education and licensure, obviously, the acts and rules, professional standards, just like we've talked about from your organizations, and then competence and experience. And this is just an example of the NSBN Model Acts, what they say the scope of practice is. And what I want you to focus on this slide is how generalized these statements are. Assisting in nursing interventions to implement the plan of care, teaching the theory of nursing, evaluating responses to interventions. So While this is helpful and it really does tell us what we can and can't do as nurses, it does leave a lot of people scratching their head thinking, well, how do I know if I can really give amiodarone? It doesn't say that I can do it. It doesn't say that I can't do it. How do I know that I can do it? Well, um, the NCSBN developed the decision-making model, and many states have actually incorporated this into their policies, procedures, and guidelines to tell you, and some have incorporated it into the rules as well. So if somebody calls the Board of Nursing and they say, I want to place a three-way Foley. Can I do that? Well, they might say, have you consulted your decision-making model? So the decision-making model was created because there's no way that all of the state boards can keep up with all of the changes and advances that we see in healthcare. And it's for all levels of licensure. So if you go through this and everything is answered with yes, then the nurse can proceed with performing the activity according to the acceptable and prevailing standards of safe nursing. So what you'll find is this process directs you right back to what we just talked about a few slides ago. So number one, it says, is the activity prohibited by the Nurse Practice Act, the rules, or any other applicable law? Now, what's important about this question is they really do mean any applicable law. They mean the DEA, they mean the medical board, they mean the Pharmacy Act. So it's really important to make sure that if you don't know all the laws, that you find an attorney to help you, that you reach out and make sure that you're considering everything. For example, the pharmacy board law likely says it lists certain people who can and cannot compound medications. So even though you aren't a pharmacist and you don't have a pharmacy license, that law does limit the people in your jurisdiction who can do compounding. So that's just an example of how broad and overarching question number one can be. Number two, is it activity-based? Is it consistent with evidence-based nursing care? And these are different everywhere. This is just this particular decision-making model from the NCSB, and some states are different. They have different steps or fewer steps or even more steps. Number three, are there policies and procedures in place? And this can either be with the board or your employer. Number four, do you have the education to perform this thing? Number five, do you have documented competence? Number six, are there appropriate resources available to do the action? That would be like walking into a code without a crash cart. You would want to make sure that you had all your supplies ready. Number seven, would a reasonable and prudent nurse perform this activity? And last, this item uses the word accountability, but I've actually seen this last question written on many states' decision-making models that says, is the nurse prepared to be completely responsible for their actions or to accept the responsibility of your actions? And so really what that means, if you are going to perform an intervention and something goes terribly wrong, can you personally fix it? So if you get through all of those steps, you want to make sure that you can say yes to every single one of those things before you execute that nursing function. And so with that being said, that's why I always say scope of practice means your personal scope of practice. Just because a job description says that you can do it doesn't mean that you can do it. You may be an expert at delivering babies, and I might be an expert at nursing in a liver transplant function, but it doesn't mean that just because we're both nurses that I could go do your job for a day and you could come do mine. Nurses anymore are highly specialized. Every single one of you and every single one of your units is an expert in that thing. We don't so much see general nurses that can just float to anywhere in a hospital. Now, they definitely exist, but they're very special people that should be protected at all costs. But the most of us are highly specialized, and we have to function within our personal scope of practice. And we touched on this in our last webinar, but I think it's a good example to bring up again. A great point on this is medication administration. So let's say I have a ton of experience with anti-rejection medications, but that doesn't mean that I am even close to competent to even consider administering a cardiac drip. So while my Nursing Practice Act likely says that I can administer medications, my personal scope of practice tells me what I can and cannot do based on how really comfortable with I am. And it's your job to be a steward of what is within your scope of practice and expressing that during your job. So, as we all know, practicing outside of your scope can bear with it a number of issues. You can cause harm to a patient, there can be professional consequences, disciplinary action, or even malpractice action. And that's where investigations comes into play from the Board of Nursing. So it's a common misconception, and this is true in most jurisdictions, not all, that there are not nurse licensing investigators out in the field looking for violations. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't go into the field and that they won't. They might go into the field to follow up with a complaint, but they're normally not planted in places watching, waiting for you to make a mistake. So, some things to know about investigations is that they're all investigated completely different from one another. And what that means is that just because you committed a HIPAA violation or a privacy or committed a privacy issue doesn't mean that the other nurse who had a HIPAA violation, that you guys are all going to get the same punishment or the same outcome. Every single one of these cases is investigated completely separately. So same is true for abandonment. Just like we talked about in our last presentation, there are so many different forms of abandonment and they aren't all the same. And the board understands that and takes that into consideration. And so they look at each individual complaint to the board with specificity. So most investigations, like I said, originate with a complaint from either a member of the public, an employer, or another licensee. And according to the National Practitioner Data Bank, in recent years, nursing professionals are on average more than 60 times more likely to be involved in an adverse licensing action than a medical malpractice payment. So often, that being said, your employer can be someone who reports a nurse to the board. And in this case, they wouldn't be able to defend you, and your malpractice policy would be your saving grace if you had one. So, um, and I'm not sure if you know this either, but almost all nursing practice acts require that you report any other licensed nurse who violates the act. And that's a large reason why there's so much employer reporting, is because they know these acts inside and out, and they know that they are required to report if they know a nurse that violated the act. And unlike civil and criminal suits that have statutes of limitations, so what that means is if a patient was harmed, depending on the jurisdiction, she might have 2 years to file a lawsuit. Well, most states, there is no timeline for filing a complaint against a nurse. And that's because the boards are of the opinion that public safety is not time limited. So complaints can happen about any part of your practice at any time. And then once a complaint is made, the investigative process gets initiated. So, like I said, it starts with a complaint. They review the complaint, it goes to the investigative division. If they determine it needs to go to the board, there'll be board proceedings, a board action, and then reporting and enforcement. For some lower level findings, like maybe a privacy issue, the board staff and those investigators will review that and they'll say, we recommend a fine in this class, but that still has to go get approved by the board before they can impose that. So as you can see, the process isn't short and it can take months or years. There is no clock for the Board of Nursing. It just takes as long as it takes. Some boards may have one investigator for the whole jurisdiction. Some might have 20, but typically the agency's staff is determined by the state government. So they can't just say, oh my gosh, we have so many cases, we need more investigators. They really just have what they have. And what do they mean by licensing actions and discipline? Well, this can take a whole different form of actions. There can be an advisory level, which is something that you might get for a lapse in your licensure if it's a single offense. You might get an advisory letter, and this would not be in your record depending on the jurisdiction. There can, of course, be a denial or revocation or just suspension of your license. There can be administrative penalties, which are just fines that you're required to pay. There can be a referral to an alternative to discipline program. There can be requirements for monitoring, remediation, or education in your practice. And remediation courses and fines, like I mentioned earlier, that's what you see most with privacy or HIPAA violations. And then most boards have reciprocity with other boards. So these actions can follow you. Likely, if you hold a license in 8 states, whatever they do in one, likely another investigation will come up with another board where they will reaffirm what that initial board found. And they did this because they don't want nurses to be able to evade these nursing board actions just by going to another jurisdiction. So another thing a board can do is they can immediately suspend a license after the board's consideration of a complaint and the immediate evidence that's available. The general standard or the burden of proof that a board has to go by is that the evidence must be clear and convincing or beyond a reasonable doubt. You hear those phrases for the board to take action. And if that isn't there, they can't take action. The action may be revised after a full investigation if they do take emergency measures. And the disciplinary actions are often public record. So you can go on your nursing board website and pull up any of the disciplinary actions that have been taken and what for. And I encourage you to do that. And they can also report these to databases and the National Provider Data Bank. So let's talk about worst case scenario. You've been reported and now you're being investigated. So the board will likely have an attorney there to prosecute you. And it's so important that you have one as well. So they'll either have the attorney general or they'll have a staff attorney or a hired private attorney or someone that they contract with that will be there who will prosecute you just like you're being charged in court, and they'll question you. So first thing you want to do is reach out to your professional liability insurance carrier if you have one and seek legal counsel immediately. And it's crucial that you do this to protect your own rights. They're making sure that they're protecting their rights. So it's important that you make sure you have someone there to protect yours. Be proactive if any of the issues that they find are founded, such as substance abuse. You could consider voluntary treatment or participate in an alternative to discipline program. But often you forego these opportunities if you don't initiate that before the incident occurs. So likely in many states, you'll see nurses will enter these programs voluntarily beforehand, so that that way, if something does happen, they can say, well, I'm in the part of this program and there's monitoring in place. And that can, instead of just punishing nurses who have substance abuse disorders or substance use disorders. What you should always do is retain all documents and letters that have to do with the case in your correspondence with the board. Always respond promptly. Always cooperate, but protect your rights, knowing that in any conversation that you have, anything you say and your communications can be used in prosecuting your case. Never discuss it with anyone that you work with, anybody other than your defense attorney. That's who you want to discuss the case with. Be cautious about any statements that you make. Don't discuss with colleagues or ever take to social media. And don't talk to anyone without consulting your insurance company and or your defense attorney, and that includes the board. So it's important to contact them immediately and then loop back in with the board regarding the investigation. And I think it's hard for nurses to comprehend this sometimes because we don't realize there's a whole industry of attorneys who exist to protect people's licenses. And so while professional liability for us is malpractice, just like it would be for a physician, there's the same thing for pharmacists, architects, anybody who holds a license. There are licensure defense attorneys that specialize in this kind of work. And so that's likely if you have malpractice insurance, who they will find to assist you in defending your license. And the proceedings for a nurse with legal representation from experience look a little bit differently from someone who doesn't. So they start questioning the nurse and they just have to stand up by themselves. Where in another instance, you have an attorney who's sitting right there next to you who is listening and determining whether or not you should answer that question. And so it's just incredibly important to have the right person by your side as you are navigating these instances. And we have one question, which is, are disciplinary actions available to the general public? So depending on the state, they will determine which ones get reported when you look up the nurse's license. So if there is a disciplinary action, likely when you look up that nurse's license, you'll be able to see it listed there. It will likely lack a lot of specificity, but depending on the level of the action that the board determines to take, depends on whether or not it will show up there. Now, like I said, sometimes with things like advisory letters for like a lapsed license, sometimes those things they won't report under that licensure when you look them up, but some do. And then some boards report all of this to the NCSBN. So if you look up a license for a nurse that participates in a state that uses NurseSys, if you look up somebody in a state, it might be there as well, in addition to in their state boards, but not all state boards funnel that information to the NCSBN. And last, I wanted to put a comprehensive slide for the most common reasons that we see licenses get disciplined. So one of the very big ones is substance abuse. This is so common, we know, in our profession. And the good news is that nursing boards are doing a lot to treat this in a way that is current with the standards for treating substance abuse. So a lot of states are now using medication assisted treatment and using more things than just abstinence. Now, some states still have abstinence and they do periodic drug testing. If you test positive at all, you'll be in default of the program. It just depends on the state. But a lot of states are now encouraged to kind of move with the standard of care because we expect nurses to provide standard of care for their patients. So a lot of states are of the philosophy that we should be providing the standard of care to them. Practicing outside your scope, we see that, or without the proper supervision. Negligence or incompetence, so doing something that you don't know how to do, so it might be inside your scope, but you aren't competent to do it. We see licenses get disciplined for criminal convictions, boundary violations, which would be like an inappropriate relationship with a patient or a patient's family member, privacy violations, failure to follow nursing standards, and unprofessional conduct. Now, this one has a very loose definition, and it's often used in reporting. So falsifying records, abuse of any kind, manipulating drug supplies, falsifying documents to the board. And this actually includes making an error or omission on your application or renewal. They can discipline your license for that. So I would highly encourage all of you to, when you apply for licensure or renew your license, go through every field with a fine-tooth comb because you don't want to inadvertently falsify a document that says you completed something that you actually hadn't, or make an attestation to something as true that wasn't true. Other things that fall in this bucket are abandonment issues, privacy issues, conduct detrimental to public interest. That's really vague, but that's something that you can report someone for in some states. Discrimination in the rendering of care, prescription forgery, selling drugs or making drugs available to family or friends, sexual boundary violations, as we discussed, inappropriate billing practices, improper custody of controlled substances, and diversion. And then in some states, it just says any conduct that jeopardizes a patient's life. And as we all know, those perceptions of people in the room are all different. So with that said, I would highly encourage you to look at your practice acts and in your rules to see what is under required reporting, because it will tell you. And then lastly, This is Erin. I think she's on our call with us today, and she is our liaison between pro liability and Sigma. And she is just a wonderful person and loves Sigma passionately. And she's a great contact if you're looking into finding your own professional liability insurance. You can scan there to get a quote if you want today. And it's just a great program and that works together with Sigma to get you guys really great rates. And I'm so appreciative that they had me here to talk with you all today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Madison, for sharing all of this information. We're getting great comments in the chat feature. Let's kind of take a deeper dive with some of these questions if you're ready.
All right.
All right. So I think let's talk a little bit about the unprofessional conduct that you talked about in the last slide. With so much bullying noted in the literature, is this considered unprofessional conduct that is reportable to the boards?
I think depending on how your states are written, um, it certainly could. Um, I think the first thing to do would be to determine if it's affecting care that's being provided, if it funnels down to affecting a patient, if it's ever illegal, verging on illegal, like harassment or something like that. It could potentially be something to be reported. But again, I would encourage you to um, go to your Nursing Practice Act and your rules and go to disciplinary action and look at what is reportable. But like I said, a lot of them are written in a very broad and overarching way to where they really can catch a lot of things. But um, I think that's a really good question. And I think that working with your state association might be a good option too. There might be standards as far as behavior that's set by your state association. So I would encourage you to look there as well.
And Madison, are you familiar with CGFNS, the Commission on Graduates of Foreign Nursing Schools? And one participant asked, what's the difference between kind of what you talked about with international boards and CGFNS?
I am not as familiar with CGFNS. I know that some state boards do utilize them to assist them in credentialing or licensing providers who are first licensed in a foreign jurisdiction or somewhere outside of the United States. I know that the state boards do work closely together with them when they are licensing people from other jurisdictions.
Yeah, kind of completely separate from what we were talking about, as it's a nonprofit organization based in the United States and does help facilitate international nurses to practice in the United States if CGFNS certification is recognized in that country. Um, we have just kind of a little bit of feedback, and maybe you could expound on this, Madison. One individual was asked to be involved in a substance abuse case at their hospital where many other nurses were given video evidence documentation to determine what disciplinary action the nurse needed. What do you think about that and the entire process with video documentation to really examine what the nurse should go through for remediation?
That's really interesting, and I haven't seen that personally in practice, but I do think that that is a really fascinating approach to that. What I always go back to is comparing a nurse to what a reasonable and prudent nurse would be. That would be a way that you could ascertain that, and so I think that that's incredibly interesting. I have not seen that before.
This is a really great question about liability insurance. So this individual got liability insurance about 15 years ago, specifically pro liability, while they were working in a surgical area. They left surgical services to teach about 3 years ago. Does it matter where you go with your work if you don't work in the same field?
Sure. So, depending on your carrier, they likely structure your professional liability malpractice insurance based on the level of risk of your specialty. So I can't say with certainty, but it may be less risky to do education. And so you can call and likely talk to someone and say, hey, I'm no longer in that specialty. I just want to make sure I'm current. Or when you go for renewal, it'll ask you what area you're in and you can specify there likely. But if you call customer service, they'll be able to assist you.
And Aaron put in the chat, thank you, Aaron, for speaking to this. You might want to look at getting an educator policy versus a nurse policy. That's great. Thank you for that feedback. And then this is a little bit different question related to students. So if a student is attending in one state and they want to move to a compact state, where should they obtain their license? And what if they think about moving to different states? How would you suggest that they go about applying for their license?
So, like I mentioned on that nursing licensure slide, you can only apply for the nursing compact where they consider you to be a resident. And if you go to their website, they have an awesome Q&A for prospective license holders. So I don't know if when you graduate, what kind of lapse of time there'll be before you start working or applying for jobs. You would apply wherever you want to take the NCLEX exam. That can be super helpful, but I would reference that there's an awesome Q&A in there, not only for the NCLEX exam, but for potential nurse licensure compact licensees that can walk you through almost any scenario. And I think they even have like a Q&A that you can submit questions to help you as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for answering that. Can you teach in a nursing program at a university if your license is suspended?
So, like we just saw on that one slide where I showed the Model Act, teaching nursing and its associated functions in many states is considered to be practicing nursing. Likely, nursing boards will say any job description in which you're required to hold a license is considered practicing nursing. So even though you might not have anything to do with the field of nursing, if your job description says that you must be a registered nurse to do it, that could be considered practicing nursing. But anything on that list, most states will acknowledge teaching, but consult your list of scope of practice for that state, and that will tell you if that is considered practicing. And I will tell you, err on the side of caution. When in doubt, do not practice without a license. As you know, that with what we just covered, that can have significant ramifications. And you can always call your board to clarify as well.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And I like the additive of always err on the side of caution. Let's see, we have just a few more minutes left. So if you're in a state that is not compact and you work in a state that is, should I have license in both states?
You need to have an active license wherever the practicing is occurring. And the practicing is occurring where the patient is in the instance of telehealth or telemedicine. That's how most jurisdictions would determine that. So wherever the practice is happening, you need to be licensed there.
And then one other question regarding state licensures. Do you know how, if you have licenses in more than one state, what the reporting looks like if you have an infraction in one state? Would the other states find out? Would they know? Is there a process for that? What does that look like?
So it depends. And like I said, some of these states report to that bigger repository and some kind of work on islands, but typically there'll be an attestation when you either apply for licensure in another state or apply to renew in another state. You might want to look at those nursing practice acts and rules to see if you are required to report yourself voluntarily to that state. And normally you'll be prompted to do so at application or relicensure. And then sometimes the state that you were reported in will just reach out to those other boards and say, we just want you to know we took action against so and so. And then the next thing is they will send you that they're doing an investigation in that state.
And speaking of discipline and action, what does it mean for a nurse to be disciplined, such as a suspension? How is their long-term career affected, and what does that do for their ability to continue to practice?
So that will be reported on your licensure. So likely if somebody pulled you up in that state, they could see that. If they report to that big national repository, they could see it. So future employers would see that. Some employers have on their applications, has your license ever been suspended? You may want to reapply for licensure sooner than you normally would, just in case they funnel you back through investigation to make sure that you did all the things that you're supposed to do. Anytime you renew, they might dig a little bit deeper into your license instead of just clicking through. So if you have any action on your licensure, I always say just give a little bit more time for some of the processes that involve licensing moving forward. And like I said, that will be seen by future employers and will be seen by future states that you go to get licensed in. That certainly doesn't mean that you won't be employed again, but there may be a little bit to that vetting process when you're onboarding or being selected for hire at those new roles.
And we're going to squeak in one more question before we close for today. I'm not sure if you'll know the answer to this, but is there a place nurses can go to obtain information for how nurses are or are not approved to practice in other countries, such as part of a medical mission trip?
So, like we mentioned with telehealth before, the same principle applies. The act or the practice of nursing is occurring wherever the patient is. And so, in those instances, you would want to reach out to that board of nursing. And so, there are some things written into certain jurisdictions that say, and this is completely for example, because like I said, this is not in every jurisdiction. But some will have a clause that will say something like, if you're here for less than 7 consecutive days in 1 year, you do not require a license to work here. And that would cover for people who are maybe traveling with a private patient that they are a private nurse to, or a camp nurse, or something of that nature. So go to wherever that jurisdiction is. But as far as a comprehensive um, licensing requirement for international nursing or even just in within the United States, that would be wonderful. I would always back that up by going to that jurisdiction though and validating the information that you got, because we have seen a lot of examples of organizations who have tried to aggregate that information for us, not necessarily on this exact practice issue, but on things like prescriptions and things like that. And the legislation in these places changes so quickly that those quickly become out of date. So the true north, the only way to really know is to go to that jurisdiction's board of nursing and validate with their law.
Thank you so much, Madison, for answering all of these questions. Before we close out and end this webinar series, do you have any final words to share with our participants about maybe webinar 1, 2, or 3? Anything you would like to share?
Well, I'm so glad for those of you who stuck with us, and for those of you who wanted to learn more about how licensing works or how regulation works in your state. It really is something that the more you know about, you don't have to be afraid of. Because I always say a scared nurse is not the best nurse that they can be. So educating yourself on how it works in your jurisdiction is only going to make you better, provide you with more confidence to understand the part of the system and the jurisdiction that you're in. And being a part of programs like Sigma, your professional nursing organizations in your state will only help you understand these processes even further and provide you resources for when you need them the most.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Madison, and thank you for sharing all of this great information over these last 3 webinars. Sigma is grateful that you took the time to share with our audience, and we definitely look forward to hearing more from you in the future. We hope that you enjoyed this webinar. We have updated our process so webinar attendees can access our learning management system right away at the conclusion of this webinar to complete the evaluation and obtain your certificate. Please note that we have added the link in the chat multiple times for you. However, if you do not get the link, you can just go to our learning management system and search the title of the webinar today. In addition, we will also send an email within a week with the link as well. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar series, Creating Safety Nets for Your Nursing Practice. Protect your patients, protect yourself. Have a wonderful day.